Welcome to the Crime Redefined podcast, produced by Zero Cliff Media. Coming to you from the US Bank Tower, high above downtown Los Angeles. In our podcast, we drill deep into forensics and criminal investigation from the viewpoint of the defense, as well as explore the intersection of the media and the justice system.
Welcome to Crime Redefined. I'm Mehul Angeria, here with my co-host Dion Mitchell. Today, we're going to continue our series on the case of People versus Jane Dorotik. And our guest today has been on Crime Redefined previously. Paula Mitchell will be joining us. And if you want to check out our past interview with her, the episode was entitled Loyola Project for the Innocent.
Until very recently, Paula was the legal director for the Project of the Innocent at Loyola Law School. She worked tirelessly on the defense of Jane Dorotik. She's an excellent guest, and we look forward to learning more about the evidence and the legal proceedings in this intriguing case.
Paula is now the director of a brand new chapter of the Innocence Project, and it's called the Los Angeles Innocence Project. So we're going to talk to her a little bit about that exciting new venture as well. But let's give a little refresher on the basics of the Jane Dorotik case. So the body of Robert Dorotik was found in a wooded area in North San Diego County on Monday, February 14th of 2000. His wife, Jane Dorotik, had reported him missing the previous day when he had not returned from a jog. In June of 2001, Jane was convicted for the murder of her husband and was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison.
In 2016, Jane finally was awarded post-conviction DNA testing on evidence in her case. It was at this time that she started working with the Loyola Project for the Innocent. We previously had Paula and Adam from LPI on Crime Redefined. The results of the 2016 DNA testing were deemed not helpful at the time.
While LPI continued to work feverishly on Jane's case, she was granted a temporary release due to COVID in April of 2020. Meanwhile, additional post-conviction DNA testing was performed, and LPI was developing a lot of new evidence. Jane's conviction was overturned in July of 2020.
Jane's ordeal was not over, however. The DA's office decided to conduct testing of their own and pursue retrying Jane. After a lengthy preliminary hearing, a new trial was imminent. On the eve of trial, the DA's office announced that they were dismissing the case.
Well, with that, let's see what we can learn from an insider, Paula Mitchell. Hey, Paula, welcome back to Crime Redefined.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
You know, in terms of your legal career, where would you say that the Jane Dorotik case ranks for you as far as cases that are going to stay with you and have maybe perhaps shook your faith in the criminal justice system?
Well, it is certainly up there on the list. I think one thing I learned from Jane's case, which I wasn't super clear about or aware of prior, is just how carefully forensic evidence needs to be analyzed or perhaps reanalyzed in cases where that evidence perhaps wasn't sufficiently challenged at a trial that resulted in the conviction. I think a lot of time people assume that, well, if it's forensic evidence, it's scientific and therefore it's black and white and
Right.
There's a gray area. And that's just not always the case.
Hey, Paula, I just want to second, thanks for joining us again. And we really appreciate having your insight on such an important case as Jane's.
Thank you.
I want to go way back. How did Jane Dorotik's case first get on your radar? And to the best of your memory, what were your first impressions of the case before meeting Jane?
So I started at the Loyola Law School Project for the Innocent in 2015, and I got a letter from Jane saying that she was innocent and that she's been fighting to prove her innocence for quite a long time. She had filed some habeas petitions on her own, and those were denied. And she was in the middle of trying to get the court to allow her to do DNA testing on some of the critical items of evidence in her case, including some blood that was found under her husband's fingernails and the rope around his neck. And she needed help because she was in the middle of this process of asking for DNA testing and was just not quite sure how to proceed. I was new and hadn't worked on a DNA case before, but it sounded to me like she definitely did need some help. So we decided initially just to get on the case to try to help her with that request for DNA testing. And after the DNA testing results came back, we were pretty troubled by what we saw. First of all, she had asked the court to send the evidence to an independent lab rather than a law enforcement lab. And the court denied that request and sent it back to the San Diego County Sheriff's Department Crime Lab. And they did the initial testing in the case, which she was troubled by. And the more I looked into it, I was troubled by. So when we saw the results, my impression was that they didn't do a very thorough job. And at that point, we reached out to a DNA expert. Some of you may know, Mr. Anjaria. And
never heard of him.
It seems he agreed with my assessment that there were the DNA testing that was done raised more questions than it answered. And so at that point, we decided we needed to do a much deeper dive.
Okay, so just to be clear, then she contacted you and you were all in. This was just, you were going to kind of ride side saddle with her a little bit, give her some help. But then when the results started to come back, that kind of inspired you to get more involved with the case. Is that a fair?
Yes, that's absolutely correct.
Okay.
So there's, of course, looking at a case on paper, and then there's the phase where you start interacting with the players, most importantly, the defendant. To the best of your memory, Paula, take us back to that first prison visit with Jane. And, what were your initial impressions of Jane?
I was immediately impressed by how thoughtful and intelligent she is and was, and how familiar with all of the evidence in her own case she was. And she was able to point us to a number of problems that we agreed needed to be reinvestigated right away. So she was just very hands-on. She knew she was innocent, and she knew she didn't do this crime. And she felt that the investigation that was conducted was done hastily and a lot was missed. And so at that point, we worked with our students and investigators and started doing a real thorough investigation.
She sounded like she really coached herself up very quickly.
Well, I think that didn't really begin until after she was convicted. She had, by her own admission, a lot of naivete about how the system worked. And she just assumed that because she was innocent, she would be found not guilty. And she trusted her attorneys. She trusted the jury system. And it wasn't until the guilty verdict came back that she really realized that she was going to have to get much, much more involved in her own case if she was ever going to get justice.
Well, Paula, when you and your team first started looking at all of the blood and DNA evidence, was that something that seemed overwhelming to deal with at the time? And then kind of what was your learning curve like?
It was a very steep learning curve. The case against Jane rested heavily on a blood stain pattern analysis report that was done by a criminalist, Charles Merritt, who made a lot of conclusions about how this crime occurred in the Dorotik's bedroom based on what we now know was very little training and actually very little experience. So we had to become experts quickly on what limitations there are to bloodstain pattern analysis, what kinds of training and experience someone who's going to go to a scene to try to assess whether a crime occurred there, particularly as here in Jane's case, where we don't know when Robert Dorotik was killed, and we don't know where he was killed. The body was found several miles away from the home. And it just seemed a little too, his report seemed thin and unsupported by actual evidence, DNA evidence, and other kinds of considerations that really should go into a report like that.
Okay, so setting aside the forensic evidence for now, what were some of the shortcomings in the basic police investigation into Bob's murder?
Well, first of all, they never considered any other suspect. By their own admission, they had concluded almost immediately that Jane must have been the person who killed her husband. And our review of the investigation reports indicated that conclusion was reached based on a number of hunches and by systematically ignoring so many other leads that contradicted their own theory. So, for example, Jane told, when she called the sheriff's department to report her husband missing, she told them that he had gone out jogging and hadn't returned home. And almost immediately, they put on the 11 o'clock news a missing person report, a missing jogger report, and a number of phone calls started coming in saying, oh, I think I saw that they had a photo of her husband. I think I saw him jogging. Their theory was that he was killed a day earlier in their bedroom on Saturday rather than Sunday, which is when she reported him missing. And when they went to talk to these people who had called in to say they had seen a jogger that looked like Mr. Dorotik, the investigation into those witnesses was very brief. It was not fully documented in the police reports. And it seemed to us that they never intended to really investigate the question of whether he had gone jogging. For example, the scent dogs who were deployed during the search and rescue effort, one of them, they gave the dog the scent article, a piece of Robert Dorotik's clothing, and the dog immediately alerted and took off down this road, which was known to be his regular jogging route. So it certainly pointed to the possibility that he was out jogging, and then the dog came upon his jacket on the side of the road, some distance from their home, which also seemed to suggest that he had been jogging. So all of that evidence, which was not even most of which was not even shared with the defense, was just pushed aside, and they kept going after Jane as the person who committed this crime.
Isn't it interesting that for the police, eyewitness identification is good enough to prosecute somebody, but here, when the defense was bringing up exculpatory eyewitness evidence, they threw in the trash?
That's right. And 20 years later, at the hearing that was held in Vista over the last year, we were able to show, by calling those same sheriff's deputies and homicide investigators, that they in fact did miss a number of pretty important clues and did not investigate them and did not follow up on them. And those are things they admitted while they were testifying under oath.
Well, Paula, what is your impression of the media coverage on Jane's case over the years, and including some of these TV shows like Forensic Files and Snapped, which I think, quite honestly, need to produce updated episodes based on how the case actually turned out?
Well, I certainly couldn't agree with you more. I think, true crime shows, as they're called, are often referred to, are, they're sensational by design. They're supposed to prompt the audience to reach a certain conclusion. And almost without exception, the conclusion is that the person who was convicted is the person who committed the crime. Right. They're not designed to probe into whether the jury got it right, whether evidence was missed. And, in a case like Jane's, where she's innocent and she's had to endure 20 years of these shows going on, airing nationally in syndication, calling her, people going on these shows, calling her everything from a sociopath to all sorts of other names. People, mind you, who've never interviewed her, who really have no familiarity with the actual evidence in the case.
Right.
And they just keep repeating over and over the narrative that the prosecution presented at the trial. It's a very hard thing to come back from. And I knew that going into Jane's case, I knew that this was going to be a particularly difficult case because of that reason that the court of public opinion had already weighed in. If they weren't convinced after the guilty verdict, they certainly were after watching these shows, which aired over and over again.
It's that media, that branding, and it's just hard to get that scar off you once they hit you with it. And it also goes to one of my theories I mentioned to Mehul over the years we've done these cases, is after hiring a really good defense attorney, the second person you should hire is a really good PR person to control the narrative.
Yeah, it's true. And in Jane's case, she thought, because she's innocent and because she thought if people could see me, hear my story, they will see that I didn't commit this crime. She volunteered to be interviewed by one of those programs, and it very much backfired.
That's really a shame.
Yeah.
There's so many facets of the forensic evidence in Jane's case outside of the DNA issues. Can you talk about what the tire track evidence was portrayed to be and how ultimately it was eliminated?
Yeah, the investigators saw a number of tire impressions in a muddy shoulder of a driveway that was near where Mr. Dorotik's body was found. And they noticed some similarities to the impressions there, of which there were many. The judge at one point described it as, it looks like a bunch of spaghetti. They noticed the similarity of some of the impressions and the tires on the Dorotik's truck. And they called in the MATE team, multi-accident interdisciplinary team. I don't know if I got that right. But
Sounds
they
pretty
called
good.
California Highway Patrol to come in and use survey equipment to try to do a reconstruction of how the Dorotik's truck would have pulled up to this driveway, backed in. There were a lot of shoe impressions, footwear impressions in that same area, that their theory was that the truck was pulled in, backed in, and that then the body was removed from the back of the truck and then dragged to where it was later found. And what we discovered when we did a much more thorough review of that evidence is, first of all, they collected every possible shoe from the Dorotik's residence to try to compare it to the shoe impressions, and none of them matched. And they tried mightily to find any indication of blood in the truck bed. And Mr. Dorotik lost a tremendous amount of blood when he was attacked and assaulted. And they were unable to find any blood in the bed of the truck. And they nevertheless created this schematic, this diagram that looked very persuasive as to how these entire impressions were just, they actually said at trial, quote, an absolute match to the Dorotik's truck. When we used our own expert to review the survey that was done and looked at all of the coordinate points, looked at the way they had done this reconstruction, it was just full of flaws. And that is something that we were able to show at the hearing, that it wasn't properly documented, it wasn't properly photographed. They made these plaster casts of the tire impressions, and they were not done properly. They were broken into many pieces. It's like a box of rubble by the time we went to look at it at the crime lab. And it just, what they portrayed at the first trial as this rock solid evidence was really little more than a box of rubble.
Which agency was that?
That was the San Diego County Sheriff's Department.
We previously covered the Stephanie Crow case on Crime Redefined in an episode called She's So Cold. That was also a San Diego case. And in that case, there were obviously also issues with the crime scene processing. Paula, talk to us about the crime scene processing and the attempted reconstruction regarding blood evidence in Jane's case and how that also ultimately fell apart.
We learned during the course of the hearing over the last year that when they had Jane's consent to go into the home, she was fully cooperative. She wanted to give them access to anything and everything in her house, on her property, in her barn, 16-acre property, to see if they could find any clues as to who killed her husband. And when they went into the Dorotik's bedroom, they saw staining that appeared to be blood, and they immediately concluded that this is where he was killed. So they called the criminalist to come out, the person that was on their staff who was their purported bloodstain pattern expert. And what we learned is that when they called him out, they took him in the back door. They didn't take him in through the house. They took him straight into the bedroom, and they essentially told him this is where it happened. So he went about looking at the various stains that he could see, and coming up with a theory about how this could have happened. Jane and her family members explained to the investigators immediately when they saw stains in the bedroom that appeared to be blood. They came out and asked the family and the extended family, is there any explanation for why there might be blood? And the Dorotik's adult children said, well, for one thing, we've got 2 dogs. Both of them have bleeding injuries, and they are bleeding right now. There was blood on the leather foot hammock, footstool in the living room. There was blood found in another bedroom on a foam mattress that was on the floor because the family had assembled when they learned that Mr. Dorotik had been killed. And both of the stains that were tested in those 2 locations were consistent with animal blood. They certainly were not Mr. Dorotik's blood. And they explained that the dogs were in the bedroom, up and off the bed. And Jane also explained that her husband had suffered a nosebleed a week or 2 prior, and that he woke up and he said, oh, I had a nosebleed and I got some blood on the mattress. And so instead of telling the bloodstain pattern expert about these alternate explanations, they didn't tell him anything, and they didn't show him any of the other areas in the house that had what appeared to be blood stains on them. They just took him into the bedroom and told him this is where it happened. So he assumed that everything he was looking at, most of which were very, very minor tiny stains, that this was all part of this horrendous bludgeoning that her husband sustained in the bedroom. Apparently, their theory was while he was sleeping. So what we learned after we did a very careful review of all of the photographs and all of the investigators' statements is that they did not really follow their own procedures. They didn't take photographs of the areas that they were swabbing to collect those stains for later analysis. So they weren't really even sure which stains were swabbed. They also, the criminalist also didn't use the proper the way you're supposed to calculate directionality. If you see stains on a wall and they look like that they have been like flung onto the wall and they were going in a certain direction or they were coming from a certain direction, he did it by his own admission under oath. He did not do a thorough job, and he made a lot of assumptions. So, if you're going to base almost your entire case on that, I think it's important that you follow the rules, wear gloves, for example. This is
just the small things.
He admitted that he didn't wear gloves, and he explained that, well, I just made sure I didn't touch anything. And we have photographs of his equipment being moved from one location to another in the bedroom, clipboards, tape measures, lighting, tripod stands. It's the very same thing in the Stephanie Crow case.
Yeah, that's right.
Where they picked up blood inadvertently, they think, on a tripod. They did the very same thing in this case, used a tripod without protective coverings and so on and so forth. It was a very, very long list of errors that were made.
There, of course, were syringes found in the master, or should I say probably the primary bathroom. What were the toxicology results from the syringes and Bob's body, and what issues were raised regarding that testing?
So I think there were 6 altogether. So Jane, before she became an executive at a home health care company, she was a nurse by training and experience, and she provided a lot of veterinary care to her horses, the horses that she was raising and boarding. And she had gone to purchase vaccines. She had 4 mares who were foaling. And so she bought some vaccines that were loaded in syringes, and she vaccinated her horses, and she had another syringe that she used for another medical procedure. And these syringes were supposedly found in the very bottom of what she was using, a brown paper bag, like a grocery bag, as a wastebasket in the bathroom. And when they say that they found them in there, they didn't take photographs of anything else in the waste paper basket. So we don't really know how long they had been in there, if there were, dated receipts or other evidence in that bag that might have indicated that they've been in there for some time. So already there were concerns about the way in which these syringes were discovered.
It sounds like the San Diego Sheriff's Crime Lab, like all of their cameras were in the shop during this investigation.
It definitely does. You're supposed to take photographs of bloodstains, for example, in a certain way, at a 45-degree angle, mid-range, close range, long range, and they just didn't. They didn't do that. With respect to this toxicology and the syringes, their theory at Jane's trial in 2001 is that her plan was to inject her husband with this drug called acepromazine, which is used they called it a horse tranquilizer. It's used for a lot of reasons. When you're training a horse to be a jumper, for example, and the horse is skittish, that's the kind of drug you would give them to kind of lower their anxiety and help them learn to do this new skill. They said that they subjected one of the syringes to toxicology testing and that it had traces of acepromazine in it. The lab report that was generated as a result of that examination was incredibly sketchy, thin. It didn't have a lot of necessary information that you would need to determine whether there was actually acepromazine in there, how much was in there. But the other thing that was incredibly telling is that they searched at the autopsy, they searched Mr. Dorotik's body very, very carefully for any sign of a needle mark, that he had been injected at anywhere, and they couldn't find any needle marks. So then they went the next step and they took the stomach contents that they collected at autopsy and they sent them to an outside expert so that they could analyze the stomach contents to see if he had ingested any acepromazine. And again, that came up negative. And that was another example of a report that was not disclosed to the defense. So despite their best efforts to show that he had been injected with this drug, they were unable to show that, but they nevertheless characterized the syringe at her trial in 2001 as a smoking gun, as the most damning evidence in the case. So, if you get a good narrative going and you get the jury sucked in, you can tell quite a story.
Absolutely. And when you say that the report regarding the stomach contents was not disclosed initially, at what point in this whole process did that report actually enter your hands?
We filed a discovery motion in 2019 when we filed her petition for writ of habeas corpus, and we asked for all kinds of information from the lab. And that's when we obtained the more detailed report about just what links they went to try to ascertain whether there was any acepromazine in his system. So we got that, almost 20 years later. We also got information about testing that they had done on, there were traces of black paint that were found on Mr. Dorotik's skull bone. And they collected that and they examined it, analyzed it, and they were trying to figure out where this black paint might have come from. Their theory was that he was killed at home in the bedroom. And so what they told the jury is that, oh, he was killed, and they picked up a hammer and they waved it around and they said he was killed with some kind of household hammer like this. But what we learned later is that they sent the results of the analysis on the paint found on the skull bone to an outside expert, and he examined it and he said, this looks like it probably came from some kind of tool like a tire iron or a crowbar. And then the San Diego Sheriff's Department crime lab criminalist went to their repository of tools and pulled out a crowbar and scraped some paint from it and examined it. And it looked very, very similar to the spectrogram that was done on the paint from the skull bone. Well, that was never disclosed to the defense. And in fact, they went ahead and told the jury that it was a hammer. And you don't need to be an expert to know that hammers are not painted black. You don't paint the face of the striking surface of a hammer because the paint is going to come off as soon as you strike anything. So the list of items of evidence that were not disclosed kept getting longer and longer. And every time it really supported Jane's claim that she was innocent.
As far as some of this non-disclosure, was there a claim, Paula, at some point that the DA had at least temporarily lost their entire file?
Oh, it's not a claim. They admitted it. When we made our discovery request, we asked for the DA's file, and they told Judge Elias in court that they had searched high and low and that the DA's office had lost its file. I asked them what the retention policy was, and I was told that in homicide cases and murder cases that they keep the files forever. So, it's just yet another, jaw-dropping problem with how this case was handled.
Well, time of death is, of course, always an important variable in the investigation of a homicide. What evidence was presented in the original trial regarding time of death, and how ultimately did the defense deal with it?
They concluded that Mr. Dorotik was killed on Saturday night because when they asked Jane about what they had had for dinner on Saturday, she told them they had steak and potatoes. And when they looked at the stomach contents, it looked consistent with steak and potatoes. They never bothered to ask whether there were leftovers, whether he could have had leftovers the following morning or afternoon. And so they just immediately concluded that he was killed on Saturday night. We retained our own forensic pathologist, and he reviewed everything, including the question about the time of death. And he looked at things like lividity. And in his opinion, it looked to him like the time of death was more likely Sunday night, Sunday afternoon or evening, rather than Saturday. At the trial, the prosecution called the forensic pathologist who performed the autopsy, and he testified that he was unable to determine the time of death. And they then just essentially asked the jury to conclude that it was Saturday.
You feel free, you don't have to answer this question, but I have to ask it. In your opinion, is this incompetence, laziness, rush to judgment, or all of the above?
All of the above.
Okay.
And poor training.
Yeah, I'd say maybe that probably had one of the bigger impacts. Just continuing with the laundry list of evidence, can you describe the issue with the piece of scalp that was discovered under Bob's shirt?
Yes. So Mr. Dorotik sustained a very, very severe wound to the back of his head. There was a chunk of his skull bone that was dislodged and missing, and he lost a tremendous amount of blood. One of the things that the lead investigator concluded is when they left, first of all, they left his body lying out in the elements. It was raining that day for, I think it was at least 12 hours. It might have been closer to 13. So they didn't put a cover over it. At one point they put a cover up, but it wasn't there for very long. When forensic pathologist arrived on the scene, they decided that they would disrobe him then and there. It's 5:00 on February 14th. It's dark. They removed his clothing out in this wooded area. And when they removed his t-shirt, they saw stuck to his upper chest a piece of scalp that had hair still attached to it. And the lead investigator concluded that that was evidence that he had been killed first somewhere and then dressed after, because that's the only way that this piece of scalp could have ended up under his t-shirt. And when our expert forensic pathologist reviewed the photographs and the testimony from the trial, and in his opinion, there were a number of different ways that scalp could have been put in that location, including during the disrobing process itself. So, they had their theory and they went with it, and they turned a blind eye, in my opinion, to any other explanation that would have supported the possibility that someone else committed this crime.
I remember preparing for an evidentiary hearing regarding Jane's innocence claim. And I think it was either the night before the hearing or maybe 2 nights before, you and I were emailing back and forth, and you were forwarding me all of this newly turned over information about quality issues with the laboratory and certain analysts. My question is, how significant was all of that for, number one, the DA's decision not to oppose overturning the conviction, and B, the ultimate dismissal of Jane's case?
So we filed the petition for a writ of habeas corpus in August of 2019. Along with our discovery motion, we started getting additional discovery, which only strengthened our case. And we really had concerns about some of the work that was done in the crime lab, specifically with respect to 2 criminalists. And we kept asking more questions. And we were set to begin our evidentiary hearing in July of 2020. Judge Elias ordered a hearing so that we could try to examine these concerns and this evidence. The night before, so on a Thursday night, we got hundreds of pages of information from the lab indicating that the criminalists involved in this case had been cited for a number of errors. They were supposed to have been subjected to retraining, and they weren't. And it was almost too much to take in. And the very next day is the day that the district attorney's office decided that they would concede that, based on the DNA evidence and some of the concerns that were uncovered in the crime lab, that they no longer had confidence in the conviction. So we thought that would be the end of it, because we didn't see any possible way that they would be able to retry her and get a conviction given the state of the evidence. But that's not what happened. They made the decision to go forward with the second trial. We then continued with our effort to get more and more information about the blood evidence and these problems in the lab. And one of the things we learned is that at the autopsy, they collected a vial of blood from Mr. Dorotik, and after they collected it, it was put in a room, unsealed, no heat, no tape sealing, it wasn't sealed the way you should normally handle blood, and it was left in this room along with all of the swabs of purported blood that were collected from the Dorotik's bedroom. And so it just raised this incredible number of concerns about chain of custody and how this evidence was handled. We also saw that the vial of blood was checked out by another criminalist at the very same time that the criminalist working on Jane's case was examining the swabs. So we were very concerned about the possibility of intentional or inadvertent contamination. And those are still questions we have. We never did really get an answer to why the blood vial was checked out. It should never have been checked out. They had a reference sample already to use. That's why you make a reference sample. So that was probably more than you wanted in my answer, but there just continued to be more and more issues that came up each time we got more discovery.
I want to switch gears a little bit, Paula. When there's a wrongful conviction, that means that the true perpetrator has escaped justice. I don't think we're talking out of line here, since there's an article online about the defense theory, but can you take us through what your investigation has uncovered about possible suspects and alternate theories?
Yes. So one of the things we learned when we got the discovery in 2019 and 2020 is that an individual had been on I guess I'll call it a crime spree. He had attacked other innocent bystanders on the roadside in these violent attacks, some of which he later pled guilty to. This was known to the very same sheriff's deputies who were investigating Mr. Dorotik's homicide. And for reasons I still cannot understand, they never considered this person as a possible suspect. There was a crime committed on January 15th, almost exactly a month before Mr. Dorotik was killed, that the person who committed that crime was still at large when Mr. Dorotik was killed. He committed another violent assault on, I think it was March 8th. And then again, he remained at large, and he committed another assault later in the next month in April. And at that point, he was finally arrested. And even after he was arrested, he was apparently never questioned about his whereabouts on February 13th or whether he may have had any involvement in this crime.
That seems like a big miss.
Yeah, you think.
Well, Paula, when you were last with us on Crime Redefined, you were the legal director of the Loyola Law School Project for the Innocent, aka LPI. You've got a new gig now. So can you talk to us about your new venture, including how this came to be and, what your unique angle is with this project?
Yes. Well, one of the things that happened as a result of Jane's case is our team became incredibly proficient in forensics.
Indeed.
And we had been partnering with the California Forensic Science Institute at Cal State LA for, we've now been working together with them for 4 years on a grant from the Department of Justice that is designed to allow us to go in and look at DNA, specifically DNA in cases where there might be evidence that could be DNA tested or retested. And so we had an opportunity to join the California Forensic Science Institute, and Dr. Kathy Roberts, she runs the graduate criminalistics program there. And we decided to launch a new project called Los Angeles Innocence Project, and it's innocencela.org. And I and several of my team members are now working hand in hand with these graduate students in the criminalistics program to help us in all of the forensic disciplines, toxicology, ballistics, serology, DNA, and try to just do everything we can to make the system better, to provide opportunities for particularly defense counsel to learn, get the training they need in understanding forensics, understanding how to read a crime lab report, know what they're looking for, know what questions to ask when somebody from law enforcement, a criminalist from law enforcement is testifying about the evidence. So we're really excited. We've got a couple of DNA cases right now we're working on, but we're also working on other non-forensic cases, run-of-the-mill eyewitness ID problems or cases where evidence was suppressed, all of false confession. Well, we're working on all cases, but I feel like we're incredibly well positioned right now to handle cases that involve forensics. Most of the cases we have are 20, 30, even 40 years old. And when you look at the evidence that was used to convict somebody 40 years ago, especially forensic evidence, a lot of what was considered reliable in 1982 is no longer really considered reliable. Standards have changed, technology's improved. We've gotten better at understanding how to analyze all kinds of forensic evidence. And we just hope that we can, do everything possible to improve the system, improve everyone's understanding of what should and should not be allowed in the courtroom in a murder case.
Well, something else that's unique about the Los Angeles Innocence Project is how it got its initial funding. Can you share with our listeners how that came to be?
Yes. One of the cases I worked on when I started doing this kind of work was Andrew Wilson. He was convicted of murder, robbery, and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. And these are very hard cases. It was an old case. He had been in prison for 32 years and always maintained his innocence. And we took on his case and we were able to show that he was wrongfully convicted and he was actually found innocent and exonerated. And when he was released, he decided that he wanted to file a civil rights suit, and he was able to obtain a settlement and is just deeply invested in doing whatever he can to improve the system and make sure this doesn't happen to other people. And Andrew Wilson generously made a $1 million donation to launch the Los Angeles Innocence Project because he just believes so firmly in paying it forward, doing whatever he can to help other people. And we're obviously incredibly grateful and indebted to him.
Well, let me tie this all together a little bit. What role did the staff and students of Cal State Los Angeles play during the investigation of the Dorotik case?
They were incredibly helpful. When you're new to a forensic discipline, you can Google it, you can get all of the required texts, you can read about toxicology, for example, but you really need somebody like a graduate student who is preparing to go and become a criminalist in a crime lab to kind of walk you through, well, this really should have been done this way, and this report is missing this, and this should have been signed, and this should have been. And so they were able to educate us and tell us what questions we should be asking, tell us what concerns they had about the reports. And it just was incredibly instrumental in teaching us how we needed to think about this evidence and how we needed to challenge it in the right way.
Okay, time for the big picture question. What are some of the take-home lessons for the criminal justice system that result from the Dorotik case?
I think one of the things that I saw in the Dorotik case, and I've seen it in other cases, which is incredibly frustrating, is it takes a tremendous amount of time to persuade a court that DNA testing or DNA retesting is warranted. And it also shouldn't be a highly contentious issue that an accredited independent lab is perfectly qualified to do that testing. It doesn't, or retesting. It doesn't need to go back to the very same crime lab. The DNA testing doesn't need to be done by the very same crime lab that did the initial testing, which raised so many concerns, questions, and problems. So I think one thing that really needs a close look is, why is it so contentious? Why does it take so long to persuade a district attorney's office or a court that DNA testing or retesting is warranted? It's the answer is what the answer is. It's very black and white. It's not like other kinds of evidence. And I think one of the things we hope to do going forward at the Los Angeles Innocence Project is push back really hard on the way the penal code handles requests for DNA testing. We have another case right now. It has taken us 2 years to simply find out whether evidence was preserved and whether it's in a condition that it could be DNA tested. The way evidence is handled is another thing we discovered through Jane's case and other cases. It's just incredibly problematic. I think that over the last 20, 30 years, they've made some improvements, but in the case we're working on now from 1983, we had to look at so many different agencies to discover where this forensic evidence, these physical items of evidence, could have possibly been stored before we were able to find it. And if you're innocent, if you're wrongfully convicted, and the evidence that's going to exonerate you is unfindable, or if it takes 2 years to find it, that's just not acceptable. That's a problem. And then to take another year of fighting with the district attorney's office over whether this evidence should be DNA tested, it just doesn't seem like it's serving justice.
Yeah, indeed. That's very disturbing. Thank you so much, Paula, for your time today and for taking us on such a deep dive into the Jane Dorotik case.
Well, thank you for your interest, and thank you for all of your great work, Mehul. You have taught us all so much. If you had asked me 5 years ago whether I would be able to be conversant in DNA or any of these forensic disciplines, I might not have been so sure. But it's all really, really important learning, and you've been incredibly helpful to me and our whole team. We really appreciate it.
Well, I'm so glad to hear it. It's my pleasure, and it was really an honor to be involved in Jane's case. And this is a extremely complicated case, and yeah, we're doing a multi-part series on Crime Redefined, but I think ultimately we're probably just scratching the surface of all of the issues. But Paula, best of luck with the Los Angeles Innocence Project, and keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you, Paula.
So much. Thanks for all your work. I love the podcast. You guys are doing great work.
Thank you.
We appreciate that.
That was really interesting to learn more details about the case and get the inside scoop. I thought Paula Mitchell, no relation, by the way, did a wonderful job of describing the issues with a lot of the non-DNA forensics.
Yeah.
And just kind of going over the overall quality or the lack thereof of the entire investigation.
Yeah, Paula covered a lot of ground. I mean, there's a ton of evidence in this case, a lot of it being forensic. And I think that it's very helpful to lay out what all the potholes were in this case. I mean, first of all, obviously, to make sure that Jane got justice. But secondarily, Dion, I think that this serves as hopefully a teaching moment and an example of where many, many improvements are definitely needed in the investigation and prosecution of criminal cases.
I hate to be, kind of sour about it, but I'm not going to hold my breath. It just seems like, you're going to really have maybe a major lawsuit or something like that to really invoke some changes.
Well, I feel like on this podcast that, we're a broken record, and that both on this podcast and in my work, sometimes, unfortunately, you feel like you're just banging your head against the wall.
Yeah, I can get that. It's got to be really frustrating for you and the Paula Mitchells of the world and LPI.
But, if you don't push through and get a result like...
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, if you don't continue to push through, you won't get a result like Jane.
That's right.
So,
yeah, it just
keep at it.
It was just really frustrating to hear, from her point of view, from Paula's point of view, it really came across is that the DA's office had tunnel vision. And you could really see the effect of it in this case. And it makes you wonder if a spouse of a murder victim can truly ever get a fair shake.
Yeah, right.
When you peel back the layers, the so-called scientific evidence wasn't so scientific after all, Mel.
Oh my gosh. Some of those examples Paula gave were just insane.
And scary.
So, like the crime scene guy, it sounds like basically they ushered him into the master bedroom, the primary bedroom, I should say, and just said, listen, here's where your crime scene is. Don't worry about looking anywhere in the house. And by the way, here's your conclusion. So do whatever you got to do to reach this conclusion. But we're just telling you that do all your fancy bullshit, but this is where this is going to end up. And then the other one that was interesting was the stomach contents. I mean, certainly there's science behind that. Obviously, we've heard about time of death studies for years and years, but you have to look at alternate explanations. And there was a very simple one here that Paula brought up is that, okay, maybe Bob did have that steak dinner, but maybe he had it twice. Maybe he had leftovers and had it a few times over the course of a couple of days. I mean, and that's a real common sense explanation that I think a jury can really latch onto. I mean, it just brings up an example. Let's say, Dion, that there's a piece of evidence that is tested and has no DNA on it whatsoever. And I'm hired by an attorney, and the attorney tells me, okay, your conclusion is going to be that the only possible explanation for there not being any DNA on there is that my client never touched it. And furthermore, you have to ignore the possibility that somebody wore gloves when they touched that piece of evidence, or somebody, bleached off that piece of evidence. So science is meant to be tested, and it needs to be tested and vetted in the courtroom. Otherwise, you only hear one side of the story and you only hear what's scientific about it. But meanwhile, there can be some very commonplace explanations for things, such as The Leftovers, which was elegantly simple.
Yeah, I think that was, it was frustrating to listen to, and obviously more frustrating for you and for LPI. But it really sounded like they reverse engineered this case. Right. They thought, okay, we're going to play the odds. It's probably Jane, and we're going to, bring in our forensic guy. We're going to point to all this stuff, and they're just going to reverse engineer this and try to make everything stick. And you just mentioned this a number of times, and that was also frustrating. It seemed like just absolutely common sense, and huge red flares of things just left this investigation early on.
Exactly. And if it's not questioned, boy, oh boy, can that fester and build. And then it starts probably giving the prosecutor a big head, like, okay, there's nothing stopping us here. But,
yeah, there's no roadblock at all. That's a great point.
No, like you said, my gosh, when you're looking at a spouse as a defendant, I mean, you shudder to think, do the cops think, it's probably them? So listen, if we don't do everything 100% correct or look at everything, big deal. We know that we're right.
Just remember, get that PR person right after you hire your attorney. Control that narrative.
Advice, yeah. Well, Dion, in the next episode in this series about Jane Dorotik, unfortunately, the quality of the interview guest is going to go way, way down. And that's because I will be the subject, the interviewee, I'm sorry. And you will be the interviewer.
No, this will be some good stuff. We'll be able to build on what Paula laid out for us on the forensic and do that deep dive and get a little bit more clarity in your involvement and some of the key, the key evidence and results from the DNA testing.
Well, as always, we really, truly appreciate all of the listens and the follows that we get.
Yes.
It's really exciting to see when we are getting listeners from different countries and how the international fan base is growing. So what do you think about the Jane Dorotik case? Let us know on social media, and we hope that you'll come back for the next installment in this series.
Thank you for listening to the Crime Redefined podcast. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Crime Redefined. Please send us your comments and questions and join us for the next episode.